Fame promises light, but behind its brilliance often lurks a shadow few are prepared to confront. Carl Jung understood this paradox better than most. The more a person becomes identified with the image projected onto them by the collective, the more they risk losing touch with their inner truth. To walk away from fame is not merely to abandon recognition or applause. It is to reject the prison of the persona, the mask that pleases the crowd but suffocates the soul. Jung saw how dangerous it is when the ego becomes inflated by adoration, mistaking the gaze of others for the voice of the self. The decision to step back, to turn away from the spotlight, is therefore not weakness, but an act of psychological survival and authenticity. In today's lecture, we enter this tension. The allure of fame, the cost of living as a projection, and the deeper truth of choosing wholeness or applause. The psychological danger of over-identifying with the persona created by fame lies at the very core of Jung's exploration of the psyche, because the persona is not the true self, but a mask, a functional identity constructed for the sake of adaptation. Every individual develops a persona, an image projected outward to meet the expectations of society, family, or community. It is necessary for, without it, social interaction becomes impossible. But Jung warned that when the persona becomes fused with identity, when the mask is mistaken for the whole being, the psyche becomes distorted and fragile. Fame intensifies this danger exponentially. The famous individual is not only dealing with a personal persona, but a collective one, projected and reinforced by millions of others. The crowd demands consistency from this image, and the individual begins to live more and more as the mask, losing access to their authentic self. Over time, the danger is not only psychological exhaustion, but complete alienation from one's inner life. The construction of the persona begins innocently enough. To enter society, one learns to smile at the right moments, suppress certain impulses, and emphasize qualities that earn approval. For the average person, this process is limited to a small circle. But for someone thrust into fame, the persona becomes magnified to an almost mythical level. They become known not as themselves, but as a role, an icon, a symbol, a projection of collective fantasies. This inflated persona carries immense energy because it is fed by the projections of countless people. Jung emphasized that projection is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology, and in the case of fame, the famous individual becomes a screen upon which others project their ideals, fears, desires, and expectations. The danger arises when the person begins to believe that this projection is who they truly are. The persona hardens into identity, and the individual becomes trapped in an image. Living as the persona demands constant performance. The individual must maintain the mask even when it no longer reflects their inner reality. This creates a split in the psyche, the outer life devoted to sustaining the image, the inner life increasingly neglected or suppressed. The longer this split continues, the more painful it becomes. Jung argued that neurosis often arises from precisely this kind of division, when the conscious ego refuses to acknowledge the demands of the unconscious. The unconscious continues to assert itself through dreams, symptoms, and crises, but the individual clings to the persona for fear of losing status, approval, or recognition. In the context of fame, this dynamic becomes extreme. The cost of breaking the persona feels catastrophic because it risks losing not only personal relationships, but also the collective adoration that has become a substitute for authentic identity. The danger is further magnified by inflation. Jung described inflation as the condition in which the ego identifies with larger than life forces, mistaking itself for the self or for archetypal power. Fame feeds inflation relentlessly. The crowd's applause convinces the individual that they are more than human, that the persona is reality, that the projections are truth. Yet inflation always carries the seeds of collapse. The ego is not built to carry archetypal energy without grounding, and sooner or later the weight becomes unbearable. The inflated persona becomes brittle, shattering under the pressure of expectation, scandal, or inner emptiness. What follows is often a fall into despair, addiction, or breakdown. Jung's warning was clear. The persona must remain a tool, never an identity. To mistake the mask for the self is to invite collapse. Another danger lies in the gradual silencing of the authentic voice. The famous individual begins to censor their thoughts and feelings, fearing that honesty will contradict the image. They say what is expected, act as required, and hide anything that does not fit. Over time, they lose touch with what they actually believe or desire. The persona becomes not only a mask to the public, but a mask to themselves. Jung argued that the unconscious will not tolerate this suppression indefinitely. The neglected aspects of the self, banished to the shadow, will eventually rebel. They return through compulsions, destructive behaviors, or eruptions of rage and despair. The more the persona dominates, the stronger the shadow becomes, until the psyche reaches a breaking point. Fame accelerates this process because the energy required to sustain the mask is immense, and the temptation to repress the shadow grows stronger with every performance. Fame also distorts relationships. People interact not with the authentic individual, but with the persona. Friends, partners, and even family may respond more to the image than to the person behind it. This creates profound loneliness because the individual senses that no one truly sees them. They are adored, admired, envied, but rarely known. Jung described loneliness not as the absence of people, but as the inability to communicate what matters. For the famous person trapped in their persona, this loneliness is acute. They may be surrounded by adoring crowds, yet feel utterly isolated because the world engages only with their mask. This alienation eats away at the psyche, intensifying the split between outer image and inner reality. The unconscious compensates for this imbalance through dreams and symbols, often expressing the truth the persona denies. Jungian analysis of such dreams might reveal images of masks breaking, stages collapsing, crowds turning hostile, all symbolic representations of the danger of over-identification with the persona. These dreams attempt to restore balance, urging the individual to reconnect with the self. But if ignored, the unconscious may escalate its signals, producing anxiety, depression, or even psychosomatic illness. The psyche demands wholeness, and when wholeness is denied, it creates symptoms to force attention. Fame makes it easy to dismiss these signals because the persona is rewarded externally. Yet the cost of ignoring them is eventual collapse. Jung also pointed out that the persona is always a compromise between individual authenticity and collective expectation. In the case of fame, the compromise becomes extreme because the collective expectation is overwhelming. The famous individual is asked to embody archetypes: the hero, the lover, the rebel, the saint, and these archetypes carry immense psychic energy. To live as one of these archetypes without grounding in the self is dangerous, because archetypal roles are larger than any single person can sustain. The individual becomes consumed by the role, losing individuality in the process. Jung compared this to possession, where the ego is overtaken by an archetypal figure. Fame then can function as a kind of possession, where the person no longer lives their own life, but the life projected onto them by the collective unconscious. The path of recovery from this danger requires the courage to step back, to dismantle the mask, to reconnect with the authentic self. But the ego resists because it fears annihilation. To let go of the persona feels like death, especially when fame has equated it with survival. Jung's writings suggest that this confrontation with death is necessary, not literal death, but symbolic death, the death of the false identity. Only by enduring this dissolution can the individual rediscover their true center. For some, this means walking away from fame, choosing obscurity over the prison of adoration. For others, it means maintaining a public role while cultivating an inner life, strong enough to resist identification with the mask. In either case, the task is the same: to remember that the persona is a tool, not the self. The psychological danger of identifying with the persona is not limited to celebrities, but extends to anyone who mistakes their social role for their identity. Yet fame magnifies the risk because the collective projection is so powerful and unconstant. The danger is real. To live as the persona is to live a half life, alienated from the depths of the psyche. Jung's work calls us to resist this temptation, to recognize the mask for what it is, and to turn inward toward the self. Only then can we avoid the collapse that comes from inflation, repression, and alienation. Fame may bring light, but if the persona is mistaken for the whole self, that light blinds rather than illuminates, leaving the individual trapped in an image that consumes them from within. The inner conflict between collective adoration and the authentic self is one of the most psychologically charged dilemmas Carl Jung identified, for it places the individual in a battle between external projections and inner truth. The self, in Jung's terms, is the totality of the psyche, the center that encompasses both conscious and unconscious life, the true ground of authenticity and wholeness. It is not the ego, nor the persona, nor the image the world applauds, but something deeper, eternal, and uniquely individual. Collective adoration, however, thrives on the persona, the mask the individual presents to the world. When society adores someone, it is not the self it recognizes, but the projection of ideals, fantasies, and desires onto that person's persona. The conflict arises because the psyche longs to live in harmony with the self, while the world demands the maintenance of an image. The more intense the adoration, the greater the pressure to conform to the image, and the further the individual drifts from authenticity. Jung warned that projection is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. People rarely see others as they truly are. Instead, they project onto them qualities from their own unconscious. In the case of fame, this dynamic is amplified to a collective scale. A famous individual becomes a canvas for millions of projections. One person may see them as a savior, another as a rebel, another as a lover, another as a villain. The famous figure thus becomes a container for collective fantasies, carrying the weight of archetypes far larger than any one person could embody. The crowd's adoration feels intoxicating, but is also profoundly alienating because it is not directed toward the authentic individual, but toward a symbolic role. The person behind the mask is rarely seen or understood. They live in the paradox of being adored by the world while unknown at the core of their being. This creates a fracture in the psyche, a split between outer image and inner reality. Outwardly, the individual receives endless affirmation, applause, and validation. Inwardly, they may feel hollow, unseen, or estranged from themselves. Jung identified this as the root of neurosis, the failure to align conscious life with the deeper truths of the self. The ego, flattered by adoration, clings to the persona, but the unconscious demands recognition of what lies beneath. Dreams, symptoms, and emotional disturbances begin to arise, signaling that the authentic self is being neglected. The more the individual invests in the persona to satisfy the crowd, the louder the unconscious protests until the conflict erupts in crisis. This crisis often manifests as depression, anxiety, or feelings of emptiness. Despite success and adoration, the individual feels a void that external praise cannot fill. They may engage in compulsive behaviors, seeking to numb the dissonance between outer image and inner truth. Jung observed that such behaviors often reflect the psyche's attempt to compensate for imbalance. The adoration of the crowd inflates the ego, while the neglected self withdraws its energy, producing a sense of lifelessness. The individual may appear radiant on stage or in public, but collapse in private, consumed by despair. This pattern is common among those who live under constant collective projection. Actors, musicians, leaders whose outer lives are celebrated while their inner lives deteriorate in silence. The archetypal dimension of this conflict deepens its intensity. Collective adoration often elevates an individual into the realm of archetypes. They are no longer seen as themselves, but as embodiments of the hero, the king, the goddess, the trickster, or the prophet. Archetypal energy is immense and transpersonal. It belongs to the collective unconscious, not to any one person. When an individual becomes identified with such an archetype, they are overwhelmed by energy larger than their own psyche. Jung described this as possession by an archetype, a condition that can lead to inflation, madness, or collapse. The conflict becomes unbearable because the authentic self, finite and individual, cannot coexist with the demands of archetypal projection. The more the world insists on the archetype, the more the individual risks losing their humanity. The authentic self, however, continues to call. It speaks through dreams, through subtle intuitions, through the dissatisfaction that no amount of applause can cure. It demands recognition, insisting that the individual turn inward rather than outward. This call is terrifying because it means disappointing the collective, breaking the image, and risking the loss of adoration. Yet Jung argued that individuation requires precisely this courage, the willingness to abandon false identities and live in alignment with the self. The conflict between collective adoration and authenticity cannot be resolved by compromise, but one must eventually choose whether to live as an image for others or as a whole person for oneself. This choice is not easy because collective adoration provides real rewards, wealth, influence, validation, and a sense of significance. The ego is seduced by these rewards, convincing itself that to abandon them is foolish or ungrateful. Yet the cost of clinging to them is alienation from the self, which brings suffering no external success can compensate for. Jung noted that many individuals reach a midlife crisis precisely because they have achieved external success but ignored their inner truth. The collapse of meaning at midlife is the psyche's way of forcing confrontation with the neglected self. For the famous, this crisis often comes earlier and more dramatically because the pressure of projection accelerates the conflict. The inner conflict also impacts relationships. When one is adored by the collective, personal relationships often suffer. Friends, partners, and even family may interact not with the authentic person, but with the persona. The individual longs to be seen for who they truly are, but others are blinded by the glow of the image. This deepens the sense of isolation, intensifying the conflict between external adoration and inner authenticity. The person may seek intimacy desperately, yet feel unable to trust, fearing that no one can see beyond the mask. This isolation feeds the shadow, the repressed aspects of the psyche, which grow more powerful the longer they are ignored. The result is often destructive eruptions, affairs, scandals, addictions that break the image violently, forcing the authentic self into awareness. The unconscious resists the domination of collective adoration in other ways as well. It may produce dreams of being pursued by faceless crowds, of performing endlessly without rest, or of being trapped in costumes or masks. Such dreams symbolize the psyche's protest against over-identification with the persona. They reveal the exhaustion of sustaining the image and the longing to be free. Jung would interpret these dreams as calls to integrate the neglected self, to withdraw energy from the persona and redirect it inward. But without guidance, individuals often dismiss such dreams or fear them, missing the opportunity for transformation. The conflict then intensifies until it erupts in breakdown. To integrate the authentic self in the face of collective adoration requires deliberate effort. Jung suggested practices such as solitude reflection and engagement with the unconscious through dreams and active imagination. These practices create space for the individual to reconnect with what is real within them, apart from the demands of the crowd. They remind the psyche that the self is deeper than any image, and that true worth comes not from external praise, but from alignment with inner truth. This work is difficult because it requires stepping back from the intoxicating glow of adoration, risking obscurity and facing the discomfort of the shadow. Yet, it is the only way to resolve the conflict without collapse. the conflict between collective adoration and the authentic self is not unique to the famous. It is a universal psychological struggle. Each person experiences some form of projection, whether from family, community, or society. We are all, to some extent, pressured to live as images rather than as ourselves. The difference is that fame magnifies the pressure to an extreme, making the conflict unavoidable. Jung's warning is therefore relevant to all. The persona must remain a tool, not an identity, and the self must never be sacrificed to the demands of the collective. Ultimately, the conflict is a confrontation with the deepest question of existence. Will I live as an image shaped by others, or will I live as my authentic self? Collective adoration seduces with promises of power and belonging, but it demands the sacrifice of individuality. The self calls with a quieter voice, offering authenticity and wholeness, but requiring courage and sacrifice of its own. To resolve the conflict, one must choose authenticity, for only in alignment with the self can true meaning, peace, and growth be found. Jung's work reveals that the cost of ignoring this call is too great, for no amount of applause can silence the soul's demand for wholeness. The necessity of withdrawal from external projections to preserve wholeness is one of Jung's most urgent psychological lessons, because the psyche cannot sustain indefinite identification with the images and expectations imposed by others without suffering fragmentation. When a person lives under the constant gaze of society, whether through fame, influence, or simply the demands of family and community, they become vulnerable to being shaped more by external projections than by their own authentic impulses. Jung warned that projections are not harmless perceptions, but potent psychic forces, transferring unconscious material from one person onto another. When these projections come in overwhelming waves, as they do in the case of collective adoration, the individual risks losing themselves entirely. Withdrawal is therefore not an act of cowardice or selfishness, but an act of preservation, a refusal to allow the self to be consumed by the demands of the crowd. It is a step back from illusion into authenticity, from performance into depth, from image into wholeness. The psyche is always in dialogue with both inner and outer worlds. The outer world demands adaptation. One must play roles, meet expectations, and engage in the persona to function in society. The inner world demands authenticity. One must listen to dreams, instincts, and the subtle call of the unconscious. When these two demands fall out of balance, the individual becomes trapped. Too much focus on the outer world leads to over-identification with the persona and alienation from the self. Too much withdrawal into the inner world can lead to disconnection from reality. Jung's point was not that one should abandon society entirely, but that one must withdraw enough from external projections to maintain contact with the self. Without this withdrawal, wholeness is impossible, because the authentic self cannot survive when drowned beneath layers of projection. External projections are seductive because they carry energy. When others project admiration, idealization, or fantasies onto us, it feels empowering. We begin to absorb their view of us, mistaking it for truth. The applause of the crowd, the admiration of peers, or even the praise of family creates a mirror that reflects not our authentic being, but their projections. The ego, hungry for affirmation, clings to this mirror, reinforcing the image it shows. Yet Jung warned that what others project onto us says more about them than about us. To live within these projections is to live as an object of others' unconscious desires, not as a subject of one's own destiny. Withdrawal is necessary to step out of the mirror, to turn away from the false reflection and face the deeper reality of the self. The necessity becomes even clearer when we consider the destructive power of negative projections. Just as people project their ideals onto others, they also project their fears, insecurities, and shadows. A person under the weight of collective adoration is also under the threat of collective hostility. For admiration can turn quickly into hatred when the image is broken. The same crowd that elevates an individual can destroy them when the projection fails. Jung observed this dynamic in history, where leaders, prophets, and artists were alternately revered and condemned depending on whether they fulfilled or disappointed the collective projection. To anchor one's identity in such unstable forces is to risk psychological collapse. Withdrawal provides protection, allowing the individual to root themselves in the self rather than in the fluctuating projections of others. Dreams often symbolize the danger of living under projection. Jungian analysis reveals recurring images of masks, crowds, or mirrors in the dreams of those who are overly identified with external images. These symbols represent the psyche's protest, warning that the authentic self is being eclipsed. In some dreams, the dreamer may find themselves suffocating under costumes, chased by faceless masses, or trapped on endless stages. These images dramatize the psychological suffocation caused by external projections. Withdrawal becomes not just advisable but necessary, a retreat into solitude where the individual can breathe again, reconnect with the unconscious, and remember who they are beyond the roles demanded by others. Withdrawal also serves the purpose of shadow integration. When one is immersed in external projections, there is little space to confront one's own shadow. The crowd does not want the shadow, it wants the polished image. But the shadow, repressed and ignored, grows stronger in secrecy. Jung emphasized that wholeness requires facing the shadow, acknowledging the parts of ourselves we deny. Without withdrawal, this confrontation cannot occur, because the performance of the persona takes precedence over the inner work of integration. By stepping back from projections, the individual creates the inner space to face the shadow honestly, without the pressure of maintaining an image. This inner work preserves wholeness by preventing the psyche from splitting between public perfection and private repression. The necessity of withdrawal is particularly evident in the phenomenon of burnout. Those who live constantly under external projections, whether celebrities, leaders, or ordinary people burdened by family expectations, often collapse under exhaustion. This collapse is not merely physical, but psychological, a breakdown caused by the impossibility of sustaining the demands of others indefinitely. Withdrawal, if chosen consciously, can prevent this collapse. It allows for rest, reflection, and reorientation. It provides time to hear the voice of the self again, which is often drowned out by the noise of projections. Jung compared this process to the alchemical retreat into the vessel, where transformation occurs in silence and seclusion. The individual withdraws not to escape permanently, but to undergo inner refinement, emerging later with renewed wholeness. There is also a spiritual necessity to withdraw. Jung observed that the psyche is inherently religious, oriented toward meaning, symbols, and the numinous. When one is consumed by external projections, this religious function is hijacked by the crowd. The collective becomes the false god, demanding worship and obedience to its image. Withdrawal allows the individual to redirect their energy toward the self, the inner source of meaning. In solitude, free from projections, one can encounter the unconscious directly through dreams, symbols, and inner dialogue. This encounter restores balance, reconnecting the ego with the self and preserving the sacred dimension of the psyche. Without withdrawal, the individual risks spiritual emptiness, living only for the crowd and never for the depths of their own soul. The process of withdrawal is not without fear. To step back from external projections feels like death because the ego has often equated them with survival. The person wonders, without the crowd's approval, who am I? Without their love, do I exist? Jung emphasized that this fear is precisely why withdrawal is transformative. It forces the individual to relinquish false securities and discover the deeper ground of the self. It reveals that existence does not depend on projection, but on wholeness, that identity is not a reflection of others' fantasies, but a reality rooted in the unconscious. The fear is intense, but so is the liberation that follows, for once one realizes they are more than the image, they become free to live authentically. Withdrawal is not rejection of relationship, but redefinition of it. Jung acknowledged that humans are social beings, needing connection and community. The danger lies not in relationship itself, but in relationships dominated by projection. Withdrawal allows one to return to relationships from a place of wholeness, able to give and receive without being consumed. It breaks the cycle of living as an image and restores the possibility of being known as a real person. Relationships based on authenticity rather than projection are rarer, but far more nourishing, for they affirm the self rather than the mask. Withdrawal is therefore not an abandonment of others, but a step toward more genuine connection. The necessity of withdrawal also reflects the archetypal pattern of retreat and return. Myths across cultures tell of heroes who leave the community, enter the wilderness, and confront trials before returning transformed. Jung interpreted these myths as symbolic of psychological processes. Withdrawal into solitude mirrors the hero's retreat, a necessary step before renewal. The individual leaves the projections of the collective to encounter their inner depths, integrating what was neglected, and later returns to society with new wholeness. Without this withdrawal, the hero's journey cannot unfold, and the individual remains trapped in the role the collective has assigned. The mythic resonance of withdrawal underscores its universality, showing that it is not a luxury, but a necessity for psychological growth. In practical terms, withdrawal may take many forms. It may mean leaving a career in the spotlight, stepping away from constant exposure, or simply carving out daily moments of solitude. The form matters less than the intention. To disconnect from projections long enough to reconnect with the self. Jung himself practiced this through retreats at his house in Bohlingen, where he carved stones, built towers, and lived close to nature. These retreats were not escapes, but rituals of preservation, grounding him in authenticity amidst the demands of the world. Each person must find their own form of withdrawal, tailored to their life, but the principle remains the same without stepping back. The self cannot breathe. The ultimate necessity of withdrawal is that it preserves wholeness. To live entirely for external projections is to fracture the psyche, to divide life into the image others see and the reality hidden within. This division breeds neurosis, despair, and collapse. Withdrawal heals the division by restoring balance between inner and outer life. It allows the persona to remain a useful tool without becoming a tyrant. It reminds the ego that it is not the center of being but a servant of the self. Most importantly, it gives the unconscious space to speak, ensuring that life is guided not by illusions, but by deeper truth. In this way, withdrawal is not retreat from life, but a return to it, preserving wholeness against the corrosive power of projections and anchoring existence in authenticity.